Okay, we're going to start now, and we have a couple of panelists who will also join in a couple of moments. Uh, my name is Siddharth D'Souza, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg University. And the panel this afternoon is on regulating tech sector transgressions in the EU. Before we begin, I wanted to mention that while the panel speaks and the panel title speaks about the EU, the conversation we're going to have today is actually much broader, and we have a really uh, a wonderful set of speakers who come from different parts of the world and also with different expertise. But as we begin the conversation today, I want to say a little bit about the project that we're working on at the Global Data Justice Project, which is on sector transgressions. The idea behind sector transgressions is to be able to track how firms that establish themselves in one particular sector use their computational infrastructure to be able to creep as well as pivot into a new kind of sector. We started the project drawing from the work of Tamar Sharon, and over the last year have been trying to explore how these transgressions are not one-off events, but instead are events that take place over a period of time and end up crowding out expertise. One of the things that has struck us in the past year is that sector transgressions are different from regular types of growth for businesses, different from innovation. And what has emerged is this idea that one, it's the context of the pandemic and the context of timing. Secondly, it's also a question of how these transgressions have taken place. Is it a question of government invitation? Is it a question of companies being given legitimacy through political connections? And it's also a question of how companies have used their market to abuse positions of dominance. So, what we have today is a conversation which we hope will be able to understand this phenomena of sector transgressions and to see whether this phenomena exists in different jurisdictions. And I'm really happy today to have with us uh, Mariana Rielli, who is the General Project Manager at Data Privacy Brazil. I have Ojdan Sabah, who's a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. I have Aaron Martin, who works with me at the Global Data Justice Project, as well as Scott Skinner Thompson, who's an associate professor at the University of Colorado Law School, and Usha Ramanathan, who I think will join us shortly, who is an independent researcher and human rights activist in India. Uh, so what we hope today is to also look at the question of what does sector transgressions do in terms of the dependencies it creates. We're interested in dependencies in terms of economic and functional dependencies, which results in how sort of power concentrating emerges in particular spheres in terms of creating infrastructures. We're looking at ethics transgressions, where companies who do not have the expertise are ending up dominating how public sector questions are sort of emerging, for instance, in the question of public health. We're also looking at questions of political dependencies and civic dependencies. And how we would like to structure the conversation today is around a series of questions. We will begin and I would like to invite Mariana and then Ojdan, Aaron, and Scott to reflect firstly on how they see the concept of sector transgressions in their own work and in their own regions. And if they can do so by starting with an example of a case that they see. For instance, in our work so far, which has been supported by the EUAI Fund, one aspect that has emerged repeatedly has been the ways in which the public health sector has been transgressed by security firms such as Palantir, but also transgressions taking place in edtech, transgressions that are also taking place in logistics. And these are some of the sectors that we've been looking at across 9 countries in the EU. And we would also like this conversation to explore how similar transgressions are taking place in different parts of the world. So as we begin, I'll invite Mariana to start. Mariana, over to you.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. For me, it's morning still. It's very good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm like you have already introduced me. Thanks for that. But I'm Mariana Rielli. I work at Data Privacy Brazil Research Association. And over the last few, maybe a little over a year, we have been conducting research on the it's hard to use the word legacy of COVID because it's not over yet. But the idea, the general initial idea of this research was to investigate how government in Brazil at all levels, so not just federal government, but also at the state level and at the municipal level, um, has adopted different types of data, personal data based technology to fight COVID 19. And we didn't really start with the idea or with the concept of sector transgression, like in terms of our methodology. This was not something that was necessarily in the picture. But as the research progressed, we had some indications, some results that pointed in this direction, and we have actually engaged with the Global Data Justice Project, and with some of you, we have had conversations and even inputs into our research. So to answer the question, I think in Brazil this is huge because historically, basically every social thought book, Brazilian book, will say that the public in Brazil is private. And of course, this doesn't have to do necessarily with companies, but more with the dynamics of these players and how these relationships developed over time. But so there are many possible examples, and I will keep to our own research because this is where I think I have more to contribute, which is like I said, the public health sector. And we found that nearly 60% of all suppliers of technology to government, like I said, at all levels, are in the private sector, mostly technology companies. Actually, there is one company that accounts for almost 20% of all initiatives that we were able to map. And we are still not, I think, at a point where we can say that there has been or there is an actual transgression, because we haven't looked at the history perhaps and the journey of these companies, like in their different sectors. But we have some, like I said, indications that this may be happening. And this is what has been moving us towards continuing this research. And basically, what we found was that the three most common functionalities, because we mapped different functionalities, so we're not looking just at like contact tracing, we were looking at the broader scenario, and the three most common were social isolation monitoring was the first one, then telemedicine, and third was the monitoring of a temperature, use of thermal cameras. And there are big differences between those three, because the third one, I think it's very interesting that the companies that are responsible are not Brazilian, while the others are mostly Brazilian companies. And in the case of thermal technology and facial recognition technology, the companies are mostly Chinese. But the thing that we noticed was that the arrangements, the contracts were mostly at no cost for the public entities. And this is something that appears a lot in research, how these companies provide this solutions without cost at first. And we are not at the point where we can affirm that this will change, but this is also an indication of something that may be happening, and we are following this closely. So I think I'll stop here just to say that we are working on the public health sector. And of course, another one that is very important in Brazil is public security, and we may go into that later, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mariana. Ojdan, maybe if I could ask you if you'd like to also reflect on the phenomena of sector transgressions and perhaps also connect to, as Mariana mentioned, the idea that do you see this question of the public being private also in the regions that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on this panel. It's been very interesting to hear Mariana's reflection on the concept of sector transgression, because I can also see some similarities there with the Global Data Justice Associates project, which I'm working on, which is sector transgression in East Africa. Just a brief introduction there. So in partnership with Data for Change, this project looks at cases of transgressive technologies in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And I was humbled to work with Kinfe Yilma, Grace Montungu, and Daniel Mwesigwa, who are experts on law and tech and who examined these cases. And I think one important thing is when we make the concept of sector transgression go global, we also have to understand the position of these regions in this highly connected society. And what the researchers brought really broadened the concept in two ways. So first of all, it really put to the forefront it did not only focus on tech firms, but also on this complex relation between telecom and tech. That was one side of it. And the other side of it is that it emphasized the role of development agencies and tech philanthropy, which is something that might not be as visible if we looked at sector transgression only from a high income country perspective. So one example there would be that in Ethiopia, there is a project called John Snow, which is a health information system, and it led the pandemic response in many ways. So they monitored, hand sanitizers availability, tracked health checks of travelers entering Ethiopia. They provided information about the health education through WhatsApp helpline. And what's interesting here is that they were brokered through USAID, and they worked closely with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And above all, this John Snow firm did not start with the pandemic. It predated the pandemic. It started in 2015 under the idea of providing a health information system in Ethiopia. And because Ethiopia has this long-standing relationship with international partners, it was not framed in terms of pandemic response back then, but it was framed in terms of digital inclusion and in terms of economic development. So that is to say that when we look at sector transgression, we also see that it's continuation of things that have been happening in the past.
Thanks a lot, Ojdan. And I think you bring up an important distinction with also how the project has been framed in the EU with the focus on the pandemic and the changes that have taken place there, but to sort of speak to a longer narrative. And I think this is also a good opportunity to bring in Usha Ramanathan. We've been talking about how in different regions of the world, the phenomena of sector transgressions manifests in different ways and also manifests at different points in time. And I was wondering if you could share from India, how do you see this phenomena emerging? Is it something that has been around for a while? And have you seen any sort of important examples in the last couple of years during the pandemic that have been different from the past? We can't hear you. There's a speaker right at the bottom of the screen.
And now?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm a little nervous about entering this conversation because I'm not sure I've understood uh, sectoral transgression correctly. So let's just say I'm giving another take on it. Yeah. So if it is about, see, one of the things I think we spoke about it the last time too, that technology, persons in technology and people who are leveraging technology for their business are not satisfied with finding an area where they can be. They are very keen to take as much as they can because tech now is not about any sector, it's about data. And data from any sector is exciting for them. So there are no boundaries in this. Second thing, in India, it's I'm sure there are other countries like this where the relationship between tech interests, I won't call them companies, they are tech interests and the government, it's very close. So there are things that the tech interest promises the state and promises the government, and the government creates a good ambience for the tech interest to do whatever it is that they want to do. In India, it is represented most starkly and most clearly in this thing called the iceberg, which is it's an industry roundtable. It's like we had the NASSCOM, which was made up of, it was a association of all the big tech companies. And then they decided that, some of the smaller guys needed to come in and it shouldn't be just Amazon and Facebook and Google and what have you. So they thought that they would create other products. So the whole thing became about creating products for the first, when they first began. And then it got hijacked by the ID project that we had and creating what they called was stacks. So these stacks are applications, and the idea was that it will create a platform and it will create the infrastructure, and anybody can use it to create any kind of business that they want. So actually, I'm not sure, therefore, that they've really, that the companies have been necessarily looking at it as something that is sectoral, but the state has been looking to bring everything onto these so that data can be collected from everywhere. It's using the muscle power of the state to be able to collect data from. So if I were just to give a few illustrative things, it's now in agriculture, it's in finance, is the fintech, but it's not only fintech, it's also the whole welfare state is done only through this. It's in FASTag, which is the toll collection. It is in registration of driving licenses and in registration of vehicles, which data, by the way, is what they've told them in Parliament that they're selling this data for a certain sum. Most recently, they've been saying they want to link up the voter ID with the ID database. It's in the CoWIN app, which is supposed to be holding all the information on, you can only get yourself vaccinated if you go through the CoWIN app, or whoever vaccinates you will have to put you on the CoWIN app. And there is a set of information that's held there, which then converts itself into a health ID if you give your UID along, and if you give the ID along with it. There's a social security code which says that all unorganized sector people have to get themselves onto this database with a whole range of information, including the tax information and the ID information and the telephone number and all the rest of it. If they are to get anything at all, if the state at any time decides that they want to help them through a time of distress. So this is just a continued, distress has provided an opportunity to speed these things up and to use more coercion and to threaten exclusion. But this is a pattern that we've been seeing over the past 10 years. Just two things that seemed pretty interesting. One is that we have this ID system, the UID system, which was done like a joint kind of thing between private industry by bringing in a marketing honcho from within tech industry and the government, and the whole project was run through this. Now it's about 11 years, 12. Yeah, it's about 12 years since the project began, and they had in November a meeting where two of the guys who are, all of them spoke, but in one session, which was on digital economy, you had the two people who were from government and who had worked on this ID project speaking there and saying that this project had actually been promoted, saying that this is so that the poor can have an identity and they should be able to get their whatever whatever is due to them. So you have them now saying that, listen, this was never about the state. It was never for the government. It was for creating a digital economy, and it's got hijacked by the state, and they are holding it captive. So there is a way in which they're saying that the state's job was just to create these databases so that we can create businesses out of it, so that the general GDP will go up. And this is not the first time they are doing it. It happened earlier when they said that privacy is not a fundamental right. It's not a right at all, because if it's going to be a right, it's going to be a problem. So just one thing, therefore, is that I think the place where we are seeing large number of players come in, and there is a certain amount of anxiety which we can see around us now, apart from the fact of being in all these various databases and having to identify yourself through them and be watched by somebody else who you don't know. Apart from all of that, the fintech explosion particularly is causing an enormous amount of anxiety, because various people are getting onto it. I mean, tech people are getting onto the fintech revolution, which basically they're looking at banks and their legacy data and wanting to usurp the data and make what they will of it. They've created a money movement agency which is outside of government and outside most regulations, and the government has been the prime mover, I mean, the prime marketer of that, and the prime minister has been the prime marketer of that. So, and in each of these, especially in the fintech sector, you find that Amazon and Google and Facebook and everybody is walked in. So while the intention apparently is to say that, we need to make our own businesses and we can't rely on advertising because we don't have that kind of budgets here. But we do need all these databases, and they should be ours, which means the Indian tech interest. Ours is not the people of India, it is the Indian tech interest, and therefore, we need to fight off all these Amazons and Googles and whoever else. Actually, they're creating, various scenarios where those guys come and do the major part of the business. So this is the kind of semi-complex scene that we are in now. And I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but this is, I think, obsessing my head, so I just said it.
No, thanks a lot. I think you also raise a question, and maybe Aaron, you can come in here about how useful the idea of sectors is to think about transgressions, as you say. So maybe that's one thing, Aaron, that you can begin with. But also the second aspect that you raise about the question of state capture and the capture of state institutions, and what this actually means for the dependency of the public sector. Aaron, perhaps if you could share from the work that is being done in the EU, if you see similar questions emerging.
Sure. Thank you, Siddharth. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. No, so it's actually a great time for me to sort of react to the conversation so far. And indeed, one of the questions we're grappling with in the EU focus component of the research is whether it still makes sense to talk about the tech sector as a sort of distinct area of innovation, of sort of business growth, whether, over the past sort of 10 years, and in particular during the pandemic, we've seen the sort of tech sector invade pretty much every other sector that matters, especially from a regulatory perspective. And I don't think we've sort of come to a sort of final answer on this. We're still debating internally whether there's value in still sort of holding on to this notion of a distinct tech sector, in particular because, at least for me, I have a fear that when we kind of say that the tech sector is everywhere, that the Amazons of the world, that the Googles of the world are basically like, they're no longer tech firms, that they're sort of, these monsters that operate across sectors, that we kind of lose sight of. We can sort of sharpen our hooks in terms of regulation. There's a lot of regulatory activity in Europe, in particular around, as we discussed today, digital services, digital markets, the governance of data of different kinds. And I think it helps that the starting point for a lot of those conversations is this collective understanding that that the tech sector is a thing, right? That it's not a sort of a figment of the past. And that we can identify actors within both the sort of regulatory community, but I think more broadly civil society, that can help to rein in particularly transgressive behavior by by tech companies, right? Even though they operate in, for example, finance, education, agriculture increasingly, and so forth. So I think this notion of, what is the tech sector still, and does it make sense to conceive of some of these issues as being sort of tech-driven is an important one. But also want to react to something that Mariana said, and I think this is where this question of sort of what can be done and what's the role of sort of civil society and other actors is quite important. So she mentioned that in Brazil, a lot of the innovation during the pandemic was by sort of firms using sort of Chinese sort of innovations of different kinds. And I find this question of like the geopolitical interests and sort of suspicions or concerns around the sort of the national homes of certain tech companies important, because at least in Europe, we see that there's still this push against American and Silicon Valley in particular interests, although the problems are much broader. But I think elsewhere in the world, there is this concern around China, India as well. And I think where we can use some of those sort of national interests or concerns around the geopolitics of technology in order to resist this sort of expansion of, dare I say, illegitimate technology or technology that perhaps has been developed in sort of a vacuum during the pandemic, where perhaps we haven't followed all the procurement procedures for different reasons, where we still haven't answered some questions around accountability, exclusion, so forth. It's sometimes nice to have the geopolitical card to play, right, where we can at least use that as a way to push back certain kinds of behavior by the sector, as it were. And just one final point, if I may, Siddharth. This question of no-cost contracts, I think, is really important. Just a Brazilian phenomenon. It's something we've seen in Europe as well. And this is actually where it becomes a lot harder to understand what's happening in terms of government procurement of systems, because at least when there's contracting in place where governments are paying for systems and services, we have the paper trail, we have the due diligence that's required for government spend, and where things are being offered for free. We see this a lot in the humanitarian sector as well. That makes it much harder to understand the sort of the terms of agreements. There's a lot of urgency because things are offered for free. And I'm sort of hoping that we can think further about what does it mean to offer sort of a platform or during an emergency context, in an emergency context rather, even for a temporary period at no cost, and then what that sort of allows for pushback, transparency, and resistance by a range of actors. So I hope that helps in terms of a reaction to the points made so far.
Thanks, Aaron. And Scott, maybe I'd like to bring you here to also react to a point that Aaron made towards the end of this idea of illegitimate technology, whether it's to do with questions of procurement, whether it's to do with the ways in which accountability is sought of these organizations. And I was wondering, in your reflections on tech expansion during the pandemic, how would you sort of distinguish transgressions from innovative activities, from business as usual? And what is an effective counter to this understanding that the ways in which tech companies are actually moving into new areas of business is part and parcel of their business model?
Yeah, thanks so much, Siddharth, and thanks to everybody. It's really great to be part of this conversation, and I believe we're on at least 4 different continents at the moment, which is pretty exciting. The conversation is really interesting. I think that my initial reactions, and this is not to suggest that government surveillance is indeed better than this privatized capitalist surveillance that we're seeing grow with and accelerate because of the conditions of the pandemic. But I do think that one background condition that has enabled this privatized surveillance creep or transgressions is the norm of neoliberalism and the failure of governments to be in the business of providing services anymore. And so I think that background condition is one that we need to bear in mind, because it is the one, all of these different examples, and there are some really good ones, are enabled by the failure of government to do its job. EdTech is a good example. Schools do not have the resources to serve children, so Google comes in and says, "Here's a Chromebook," and starts surveilling our children. And this is true in any of the if we're talking about contact tracing, whatever. It's the failure of government, which has been primed, which exists in part because of the tech companies' ethos of deregulation, of privatization, not just tech companies, but obviously corporations across the board, that has created this gap in governance and services, which is in turn allowed these transgressions to accelerate with in dramatic fashion. And so I think that is important, which is, I think we have to attack these, not attack, but call out and combat these symptoms. But I do think it's important to realize this is part of a broader phenomenon of neoliberalism and privatization. And I think this relates very closely and is potentially, one solution, building off of Aaron's point about geopolitics. And I think we have to be careful here not to be, I'm not suggesting this is where Aaron was headed, but be careful not to be, sort of nativist in our approach to these discussions. But at the same time, to the extent that there is an opportunity to suggest to countries, okay, if you care about your sovereignty, right, then one way in which to protect that sovereignty is to be in the business of providing government services yourself, so that when there is a crisis, you do not have to depend on either private or public goods from another country, whether that be my neighbors to the west in Silicon Valley or China. And so I think that's a potential helpful linking of those issues. So those are sort of my initial thoughts. I do think the concept is really helpful from a descriptive standpoint, to help understand the degree to which companies, and again, to other people's points, not just tech companies, but many companies now are surveillance capitalists, and the commodity is information and surveillance. I would, in terms of shaping norms, right? We've allowed ourselves to be shaped by some of these companies, and I think we need to resist some of the nomenclature that they've imposed on us at turns. And so even the idea that these are no cost contracts or free is just inaccurate from a descriptive standpoint. Like the old saying is nothing in life is free, right? And it's not free, right? There's a huge cost. And so I think we need to be sure when we're labeling them to say, they're the ones that want this, right? And that's because they are extraction industries extracting information, and so what do they need to provide in exchange for that extraction? So those are my initial thoughts, but I'm really happy to be part of the conversation and look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Mariana, if I can bring you back into the conversation, and maybe to also speak to one of the points that Scott made in terms of thinking about institutional and public sector responses, particularly as he describes when government capacity is non-existent in certain domains. In Brazil and in the work that you're doing, what role do you see for civil society and for regulators to be able to respond both in times of a pandemic, but also in terms of a longer sort of more embedded response to the fact that institutional capacities need to be strengthened.
Thanks. Okay, so lots of things that I want to react to, and I will try to do my best. I think this issue of the public sector inability or lack of resource to provide. Sorry, there's noise here. Please let me know if you can hear me. I will try to move closer. There is this issue in Brazil now that the government is actively trying to kill the population. So it's not just a lack of resource, a lack of capacity. There's also a political project, and the pandemic showed how the government was actually trying to divert attention and to not act in any reasonable way. So it's kind of hard, like right now, to understand how all these many issues play out. But what I think, going to say, and like kind of trying to answer your question about civil society, the main problem, the main limits, the main difficulty that we faced with this research was a transparency one, both public and private transparency, because we were researching technologies that had been acquired by governments, and that even though we are in a pandemic and there have been there is some level of flexibilization in terms of the public procurement. The thing is that after a year of research and over 600 Freedom of Information Act requests and lots of other attempts to gather information and to gather these contracts, these agreements, at the end we were able to acquire only half of all the initiatives that we know that took place, because there was talk in the media or even by government officials, but we were never able to locate so it's not just the no cost issue and the inability to have this paper trail, but like it's before we couldn't even access like the basic outline of these agreements. And this is a huge problem, because we can't say that it's something that the private sector is responsible for, or the public sector is actually the public sector is responsible for in this case. And so what we thought was more useful, and perhaps as a strategy to engage civil society and other organizations around this issue, was to talk about transparency, because people were more impressed and the impact was greater when we said, look, we know there things are happening, but we don't know exactly what they are, because we can have access to like the basics, something that should be public, and we can't access that. And this has garnered more attention, and then we were able to go further into the discussions of the actual numbers and the sectors that are involved, and issues of privacy, data protection, surveillance. But we started with the transparency thing, because this is something that Brazilian civil society in the last, 10 years maybe, has been has been following very closely. So I don't know, this is just an example of something that we use to garner attention and to engage people around this subject, because like in a scenario in Brazil where civil society is faced with, and not just Brazil, everywhere, but with so many problems, and the government itself is always trying to divert attention, and it's very hard sometimes to make people care about these things, especially when there's this framing of innovation and of something that can actually be good, and people don't understand the implications. So I don't know, I just thought it would be useful to bring this experience to the table. And but it's something that is very we still have a lot of work to do.
No, thanks. This is really helpful, both in terms of how you articulate the challenges of actually trying to do a monitoring and accounting of government and government departments, but also the framing of such responses in terms of transparency, in order to build solidarity amongst different organizations. Ojdan, would this be something that you also see in terms of civil society responses, or have there been other ways in which civil society responses have been framed in response to tech expansionism?
Yeah, so I can recognize the problem of opacity as something that we also see in our research. So yeah, advocating for transparency and making sure that the problem is there to the public eye is important. So I'll talk as a researcher and academic, I think also extending the scope and making it global and going beyond framings of privacy and ethics can also help in this scenario, because it allows us to make visible these other actors and also identify where we can take actionable tasks. And I think another thing, because this sector transgression happened in the perceived emergency and they rise from a pandemic, we could also pay attention to where this rhetoric has been used before. So in regions where digital humanitarianism flourished, so zones of conflict, places that are considered as perhaps economically or politically unstable, or border zones. And then we can learn from grassroots movements there on how that were directly impacted by this transgressive technologies, and learn from their experience and see how perhaps they resisted or subverted these trends. And I think this is particularly important because I feel like we're going to be heading toward a lot of other emergencies with the problems that we will be facing with climate change. So I think to have a more robust institutional response is to also listen to grassroots movements and learn from their activities. Yeah. Thank
you. Usha, do you want to also come in here and on the point of civil society responses, both in terms of challenges of how to respond and also what possible framings could be?
Yeah, it's actually a little complex here, I think. I mean, differently complex. It's not any more or less complex. It's terribly complex everywhere. But I think it's a little different in the sense that when we address the tech issues here, we are addressing the state much more than we are addressing the companies, because the companies are acting through the state. And what the obvious surveillance is being done by the state with the help of these technology companies. And I was thinking when on the question of sovereignty, for instance, I think Arun, you said this. I was thinking that actually it's very difficult here because even in some of the major state projects that they have, which are surveillance projects, they're not able to find. The state is not able to find people who will join the state. I mean, take up a job with the state to, for instance, be a security officer who will make sure that data security is maintained. So they have to then, give this work out. It's all about startup and, giving the work out to everybody else. So it's not about establishing systems as much as being opportunistic. And that's the way we are now. So the way to do it is, in a short time, get as much as you can, put it all together, because unfortunately, it's like a rush to the bottom. So it's also a competition with the really bad guys. I mean, we're talking about reining in the power of all these big corporations. And if you're competing to say, okay, I can't have that kind of power, so I'll find another kind of power that will compete with this power, then, it's, so for civil society, when you're addressing the state and the state doesn't listen, and the state has the power to coerce, to mandate, to do whatever it wants, that's one kind of problem that we are faced with. But I think the good thing that I'm seeing now, and I think I hear it in many of the meetings, is that there is a greater awareness that these are problems. Earlier, it was, seeing tech as a problem because it seemed so obscure. It was hidden. It wasn't that clear. But increasingly, we are hearing people saying, listen, we do need to do, we can't just walk into this with our eyes shut. So that's been one good thing. And then there are groups that have formed over this, over the past 10 years, which are making legal cases out of many of these. And they are really working at pushing back. They are working at, getting the courts and judges to understand. And that's a huge problem because, we go through so many discussions to understand what we are faced with. And judges just have to hear it from lawyers who themselves have no clue. And you have to be training them on, what needs to be. So it's a real, it's not a happy place to be, but people are working at it and lawyers are getting trained in understanding technology, the younger lot. And that's a huge help. So there's more discussion. But the unfortunate thing, and I think sometimes we might need to make this link too, and I mean, I'm sure we have, but I'm saying that between philanthropy, who are the richest guys today? Who is giving the money and what are they giving the money for and what do they ask in return? I think that's queering the pitch quite a lot. And I think we need to figure out what to do about that, because if you look, there is a recent article where the chap has written about all the things that have happened on this India stack kind of thing, which is what all these applications are that are being created. All of them are being done by a tech baron who's got pots of money and who's therefore getting people on to do this, create all these products, and then he has access to the state, and he in his language he evangelizes it to the state. So then we are stuck with and there is a huge crackdown in India on people getting funds. So it's a lot of things coming together. Therefore, when you say intersectoral, it's really superbly intersectoral. The one word, if I might, just as a thing, because I'm very curious about this thing of innovation and the idea that we are all rights activists in many ways. But the idea that therefore the corporate entity should have more rights than all of us should have, and that they will have the right not just to innovate, but to roll it out in our midst without any kind of, without asking us, without, figuring out how it matters, no moratorium, no licensing, no nothing, if anything goes. I think this, idealizing of innovation, maybe we need to juggle that a bit and see what it really means. It's not the individual, it's about power.
Thanks for bringing that point up, and maybe this is something that Scott you'd like to respond to on the question of innovation as power, and it also links to questions that you spoke of before about government capacity.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I do think that there is an inertia, both rhetorically and in terms of all sorts of structures in favor of that compel innovation, sometimes for the sake of innovation, without any sort of deliberation. Or democratic input on whether that innovation is harmful or not. As Usha was talking, the key example that came to my mind from the American context was the rapid proliferation of police-worn body cameras that we've seen in the United States over just a really short period of time. And in that context, civil rights groups are not of one mind on whether or not this is an important check on state power and racism or not. But what we've seen is pilot programs, and they're sort of rolled out in fast at a fast pace. Sometimes civil society is galvanized to work with the state to legitimize that, and the response is a bit more nuanced than the state might lead us to believe. And so one example is that in New York City, when they were a few years ago rolling out their body camera pilot program, which of course is a product of partnering with the private sector and companies like Palantir and Axios. They surveyed a bunch of New Yorkers, and the New Yorkers, including New Yorkers from diverse backgrounds, and their responses to the conditions under which this technology should be deployed were very nuanced, right? They had strong views about when the cameras should be activated and when not, and access to the videos after the fact, and who when officers should be able to review the videos. And so it wasn't a sort of blank check, right, that civil society and the public gave to the deployment of this innovation. But New York City ran with the top line response, which was, people approve of body cameras. Okay. The conditions under which they approved of them were extremely multifaceted, and the conditions under which New York City deployed them were not in alignment with those nuanced perspectives, right? And so the top line was taken, legitimized the innovation, and then the innovation was deployed. And now, of course, are there examples where police body cameras have captured police brutality and been used to, at least momentarily garner some measure of accountability for individual officers? Yes, there are examples of that. Are there also examples where this is being used as a innovative surveillance tool, which is further subjugating marginalized communities? Of course. And so, I think sometimes we see the innovation as a quick fix to the problem. Oh, how do we deal with police brutality? Well, let's get this video camera out. Well, the background question is, we have structural racism, oppression, and a video camera is not going to fix those conditions, right? But we just latch on to the innovation, as this was suggesting as a quick fix to longstanding structural problems, and then we use civil society and quick basically crowdsourcing of public input to legitimize that innovation, when in reality, the public response to that innovation is far more complex than we may be led to believe.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I think those examples are really compelling also to sort of problematize this whole idea of innovation. Since we're almost at time, I'd like to do one round of final reactions from our panel, and maybe I can start with you, Aaron.
Thank you, Siddharth. And just to reiterate Scott's points around sort of the this idea that sort of tech will solve all of our problems, I agree 100%. But I think we all agree here that it's quite easy and, dare I say, lazy sometimes to rely on technology or to expect technology to solve deep, more structural problems. I mean, his previous point around the context in which some of these sort of pandemic-related technologies were being deployed in the U.S. Really points to, like, for example, the need to address tax policy, right? Like, and to ask hard questions about the availability of public sector funding to respond to emergencies like COVID-19. But of course, those are not only harder sort of problems to solve, but dare I say, sort of politicized in different ways. And so technology certainly isn't the solution to most of our problems, if any of them. I will also just sort of close by reflecting on, I think, another related to the politics of this question of innovation and resistance innovation in the context of the pandemic, I'm reminded that we often find ourselves among strange bedfellows. Just last weekend, there was a big protest in Brussels against, in particular, sort of use of digital vaccination certificates for accessing restaurants and bars and so forth. And while I think many of us here would probably have, questions around, for example, the sort of legitimacy of certain technological interventions, questions of, the providers of the platforms that are being used for vaccination certificates in different countries. I imagine most of us will generally be sort of in favor of the use of, certain sorts of technological measures to manage public health, to reduce risks of coronavirus, et cetera. So I think it's what I'm trying to say is it's not that we're anti-tech or anti-innovation in our line of thinking in this project, but we're asking questions about, when does innovation become it, and what makes a technological innovation, in particular one that's provided exclusively by the private sector, legitimate or not. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much, Siddharth.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. Mariana, would you like to add some concluding thoughts?
Yes, no, I think I would just like to thank you all and say that in 1 hour, I have a lot of questions and a lot of things that I want to reflect on, and also at Data Privacy Brazil, we will keep working on them, and we hope that we will be able to continue this conversation, for example, on the on whether we should make this distinction of the tech sector. I think this is a very hard question that made me think a lot during the webinar, and I have some thoughts on that, and I think we at Data Privacy as well, considering the Brazilian scenario, and we would, of course, like to continue this conversation. Thank you very much to all.
Vajran?
Yeah, so some concluding remarks. I wanna thank you for this insightful conversation. I think this made us all reflect on what was known as perhaps techno-solutionism and how it's progressed and how we see this, tech firms gaining more power and control here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to carrying on this conversation with you all. Thanks.
Thank you. Usha, would you like to go next?
Just two things, if I can come back to. One is a kind of response to what Aaron said on this vaccination database. I actually am not defensive at all about opposing a global database on vaccination and asking that we should be showing this wherever we go, because I don't see the agenda as being vaccination and health safety at all. I think it's an opportunity that's being created because actually we don't know enough about the virus. We don't know enough about the vaccination. I think science should focus on that and not allow tech czars to want us on a global database. And I mean, I can give you illustrations earlier of how they've actually spoken about this ambition of having everyone on a global database. I really think, I mean, I'm really not defensive at all about it. I think such a database should not exist. And the second slight thing is that it's on disruption. It's actually quite interesting to see what happens here. Disruption was meant to disrupt moribund systems, but they've actually become like burning the boats. So you burn your boats so that you have to get onto the system that I'm providing for you now, whether it works for you or not, and whether it destroys all your rights or not. So I think just like we interrogate the idea of innovation, maybe we need to interrogate the idea of disruption also.
Thank you. And finally, Scott.
Gosh, well, it was a great conversation. I don't have much further to add. As Usha was talking about, it's a this final point about the vaccine databases. Something I need to give more thought about. But I will say, one, again, the impulse to track, right? Like, oh, we need to verify who has a vaccine or not. Part of the issue is that our social the reason why we think we need that, or why some people think we need that, is because the social fabric in many contexts, certainly in the United States context, is so frayed that there's an incredible lack of trust among people, among communities, between among each other and between the people and the government, that we think that that sort of command and control approach is the only thing that can solve it. And so, to the extent that my remarks have a theme, it's that there are these background problems that I think are so closely related to the surveillance issues that. And I don't have solutions for them, but I think that they are influencing the conversation in important ways. But thank you again to all of you. I learned a great deal.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. I think this is a very quick 1 hour, but I think we covered a lot of ground. I think there's several questions that you've raised in your final remarks, starting from the question of whether tech is a sector, the question of whether sector is actually a useful way of discussing such transgressions, the ways in which we can problematize innovation, problematize disruption, and also think about what are the ways and what are the challenges that actually emerge when we are creating a public sector dependencies, and also enhancing opacity through the ways in which this ecosystem around having private sector offer public services creates. So thank you so much, and thank you so much to the organizers at Privacy Camp for giving us this opportunity. And we're going to post a link to our work in case you are interested and would like to follow it. We will have a report coming out in a couple of months. Thank you again.